So today, well, I thank you to be here after the conference dinner. I guess the one who survived a large amount of wine and food. I'm going to talk about the geometry of relative locality, which is based on a series of work done with Rob Lee and George Minnick. The main theme of this talk and the whole series of work is non-locality. That is, fundamentally, you know, I'm starting to think about quantum gravity, and we expect, at least if there's one scale of agreement among all the diverse approaches in quantum gravity, the vast diversity of approach in quantum gravity, what they all have in common is one way or the other, some form of non-locality included into them. Of course, everybody really, disagrees fundamentally into how this non-locality should appear. And the question, which I find interesting, is that instead of trying to think about quantum gravity in a particular model, I would like to think, from a point of view which can include all these models, which is a more fundamental or a different way of looking at the problem, which is what kind of non-locality can we expect, and can we, what kind of non-locality can we will we have to deal with? The problem with non-locality is that all our experience with physics, especially effective field theory, but even more than that, renormalization group, causality, unitarity, all concepts around physics is based on locality. So as soon as we get rid of locality, we open Pandora's box, the Pandora's box of confusion, ambiguities. Essentially ambiguities is a big thing. Like, it's easy to quantize gravity, but there's so many ways which are gauge dependent of doing it, and arbitrary in the way you put the cutoff. And we don't really know how to make sense of non-locality. So this is what I want to address. And as I say, locality is built in everywhere. The locality of asymptotic states, the notion of particle, the locality of interaction, and even more than that, more importantly than that, the locality of the renormalization group, the fact that we have separations of scale. So why non-locality? Well, this is easy for this audience, but essentially, individually, both quantum mechanics and GR exhibit fundamental non-locality. In quantum mechanics, we have three types of non-locality: Heisenberg non-locality, in the uncertainty relation that given energy, I cannot localize things arbitrarily. Then one that is talked a lot about is the entanglement non-locality, the fact that entanglement this is the fundamental non-locality of quantum mechanics. There's one which is, I think, even more important than that, and often not emphasized. This is what I call the Aharonov-Bohm non-locality. That is the non-locality of interferences that allow Aharonov-Bohm effect. And what Aharonov have shown is that there are specific observables in quantum mechanics which have no classical analog, that Aharonov called modular observables, which are fundamentally non-local, and they are the ones that are able, that you have to use if you want to measure interferences. So observables that measure interferences are fundamentally non-local, and they are these modular observables with no classical analog. And that's going to be a big role. In GR, it's maybe less often emphasized that GR is fundamentally non-local, but for people attuned with gravity, it's more or less obvious. Essentially, it's due to Diffow invariance. The fact that you have Diffow invariance means that, like any gauge theory, you have a generalized version of the Gauss's law. The charge of gravity is energy and momenta, which means you can completely delocalize energy and momenta. This is the reason why you have holography in the first principle. Any observable in quantum gravity is fundamentally non-local. Now, you would say, well, the same is true for any gauge theory. What's special about gravity is that in gauge theory, charges can be positive and negative, so you can screen this non-locality. And effectively, non-locality is very small. But in gravity, causality, the fact that time flows in one direction, translates into the fact that the charges of gravity, masses, are only positive. And because of that, there's no screening of the non-locality of gravity. So you have to be able to deal with that. What's interesting about this non-locality is that in one way or the other, it doesn't really violate in any obvious way, causality, or even this notion of local causality. Okay, so if we put the two together, clearly, you know, this non-locality are going to add up in some ways that we don't really know how to deal with. And this is what leads me to this new point of view on quantum gravity. I want to think about quantum gravity in a different manner than we usually think about it. I want to think about it as a theory that emerged from somehow a delocalization principle. We know that quantum gravity is going to have a fundamental delocalization scale, the Planck length, and the question is whether we can formulate a theory that has a fundamental built-in delocalization scale and satisfies the relativity principle. This is the challenge. One way or the other, this is the challenge that today nobody has really been able to take, you know, fully on. But this is the point of view I'm going to take, that if I can have such a formulation, this is going to be a theory of quantum gravity. Of course, this is somehow an assumption, but this is my working assumption. And this is why it's completely new to think about quantum gravity in that way. So now, of course, when I talk about locality, I have to relax the notion of space-time a little bit. And I have to take the point of view that space-time is not a prior notion. The point of view I'm taking is that space-time is defined via the interactions of quantum probes. Okay, so space-time is somehow a relational object. It's something which follows from the way things interact. And okay, so this is the point of view I'm going to take, which is essentially the notion of space-time depends on what you mean by probes of space-time. And this leads to, so the question is what kind of organizational feature or principle we're going to use to tame non-locality. And the one I propose, and I'm going to emphasize along this talk, is what I call relative locality. That is, in relative locality, processes among probes define the process of localization, and different, you know, and this process of localization, or you know, induce a notion of space-time that might be probe dependent. And in that view, locality is relative. So this is what I want to explain today, is how we can make sense of this notion of locality being relative. And of course, we are here, you know, in the Max Born city, and this idea of relative locality is somehow nested or you know, come by thinking a lot about this idea that Max Born proposed a long time ago, that somehow any formulation of physics should respect the principle of quantum mechanics, which is this Born duality principle that mixes X and P. And relative locality is somehow a later implementation, more full-fledged implementation of this original deep Born insight. Okay, so what is relative locality? So first, I have to tell you what is absolute locality. Absolute locality is an hypothesis that you all make, but you don't even think about it because it's so obvious to you, right? It's the hypothesis that space-time is an absolute entity, which is completely probe independent. It's a universal notion. It's so universal that you can draw you know, a Penrose diagram about it and draw a particle moving in it. So this assumption that the notion of space-time is probe independent is built in any textbooks of physics, and it's built in any hypothesis you have about how you think about physics. So sometimes these, you know, obvious hypotheses, they are hard to unearth and question because they're really in the background of all of what we do. So this is what I want to do. I want to question that hypothesis. Well, not really up to today. We're going to see that in string theory, the string still. We're going to talk about string theory. In string theory, the strings, as it is formulated today, you know, this target is space-time. And as we're going to argue, but not me, but George, we're going to see that this is the wrong picture of string theory. So I don't think string theory, the claim is that string theory, yeah, satisfies the principle of relative locality, but this has not been realized up to now. So now relative locality is, in the contrary, exploring the idea that space-time is a notion that depends on the quantum nature of the probe, and especially will depend on, you know, maybe internal quantum numbers, but the thing I'm going to focus is the energy of this quantum probe. And the usual notion, which is the space-time notion, so when you talk about space-time notion, for me, what you're talking about is that you have a specific type of probe in mind. You have a notion of probes which have to have two properties. They have to be point-like, and they have to be classical. So for instance, for the string, you know, it's not true. So anytime you mention space-time, you really think about point like a classical probe. And that's why talking about space-time in the context of string is somehow an oxymoron. And we're going to see with George why. So now the question in general is, what is the proper notion of quantum space-time adapted to probes which are quantum, because probes are going to be quantum, and non-local, because somehow there's a built-in length scale in it. And that's the main question here. And if you think a bit about it, when I say about relative locality, essentially in the same way that when you go from absolute time to relative time to relativity, you know, time becomes relative to space. Here you can ask, what is space-time relative to? Space-time is going to be a relative notion to energy and momentum space. Okay. So space-time is going to be just naturally embedded into phase space, as it is in quantum mechanics. So we can ask why we want to do that, how to implement it, which is what we're going to see, and what are the consequences for space-time and effective field theory. That's essentially the plan of the talk. So in order, let me first start by illustrations of relative locality. So let's say the one thing we know is that we live in one universe. So we think. But now let's look at this one universe. And the beautiful thing is that now we have full sky surveys of this universe. And what's remarkable, it's too bad that the light is on. I think, let me shut off the lights, because they are beautiful pictures, and they're more than that. What? Okay. Anyway, so it doesn't, it looks bad. There's no way to shut off the light. Anyway, what you see here is that this is really what we see when we look at the universe. What we do is that we have to take a particular frequency, and we look at the universe at different frequency, and we don't see the same thing. I mean, that's pretty obvious. What we see is not, we don't see one space-time. What we see is a correlation, you know, on these among different pictures, correlations which are energy dependent. And from this energy dependent correlation, you know, under the assumption that this represents one space-time, we make a reconstruction. But we could try to do the other way. We could try to take these collections of pictures and try to investigate to what extent this, you know, comes from one space-time. What we really see, anytime we look at the world, is always correlations in phase space. That's the first point. This is in the microwave wavelength.
Not the microwave.
No. It's called, it's the Planck mission. It's because we have it's the Planck meeting. So no, I emphasize, yeah, it's the Planck meeting, and this is the Planck mission, you know, mapping the microwave background. You look at the universe in the microwave length. This is in the infrared. This is the X-ray picture of the universe, and this is gamma ray. I did not put, there's others. I did not put the ultra high energy picture and the visible picture, but you have a whole collection of pictures. And you know, if you give that blank to somebody that knows nothing about physics and you ask them whether it's the same thing they're looking at or not, well, I'm sure you're going to get a wide diversity of answers. No. It's the name. They looked at very low infrared energy, and they call it Planck. But maybe they were right. I don't know. We're going to see. So maybe a more interesting and deeper exemplification or illustration of this principle of relative locality is, okay, let's try to do, what do we see? Essentially, it's what do we see when we try to see how things are located in the quantum. And what's remarkable is that in the past 5-6 years, there is radically new experiments that allow us to visualize the quantum state. So essentially, here what I'm going to show is pictures of where is the electron in a quantum crystal. Essentially, what does the electron wave function looks when I look at a quantum crystal. And people can now take picture of that. The technology is very simple. It's electron tunneling microscopy. And you know, you have to be very patient because you go over every atom and you measure the current here, which is proportional to the electron density, so then you know whether there's an electron or not here. There's a control switch, which is essentially the voltage you put So the resistivity, you know, that you measure depends not only on the position you are, but essentially the energy or this voltage you're putting it. So what you see is a localization, it's a movie, in some sense it's a picture of where the electron here, depending on what energy you're looking at. You're not changing the state of the crystal. It's not like you're eating up or down. You're just looking at the same crystal, but differently, okay? So, and then you ask, you know, is my crystal an ordered system or disordered system or whatever, you know? In classical physics, it's one thing or the other. What do you see at the quantum level? This is what you see. You get a movie, which depends on the energy you use to probe the crystal. So at low energy, and again, you know, the crispness of the screen doesn't give any, doesn't allow you to appreciate this picture. At low energy, what you see is a translation invariant state. You see a space-time as we experience it, no feature. Now, if you go at higher energy, what you're going to see is an ordered system where you're going to see the electron being located really around every atom, and the scale in place here is the interatomic scale of the lattice, and that's an ordered feature. Now, if you go at higher energy, what's interesting, and it's easier if you look at it in Fourier space, is that you're going to see another scale appearing. This scale has absolutely nothing to do with the interatomic scale or the energy scale of the electron. It's called the scale of the Friedel oscillations, the fact that there are impurity there, and this impurity creates a collective interference pattern that localizes the electron at a very specific point. This is the principle of localizations in quantum material. And what happens here is that there's a new scale that appears that has nothing to do with the naive macroscopic scale or the Planck lens you put, your cutoff scale, which is due to essentially the existence of this Fermi surface. And here it's a state of matter which is purely quantum mechanical in the sense that it's just a collective collections of collective interferences which appear. And if you go to at higher energy, then you would conclude that this quantum crystal is a disordered system. So a quantum crystal is neither ordered or disordered. It's both. And in fact, when Seamus Davis was the first one to really realize this picture, tried to publish the paper, this paper was refused for many years in the literature in condensed matter because people were asking him, well, you have to make your mind. Is it is it disordered or is it ordered? And of course, these questions has absolutely no meaning in quantum mechanics, because the same object can be at two places at the same time. And this is what we're seeing here. It can be two different states at the same time. So, you know, having in mind that in quantum mechanics there's just one notion of space-time for the probe is clearly not what's going on for quantum crystal. And here what's important is that the energy is not the energy put in the crystal. It's not, I'm not eating up an eye. It's the energy of the beholder's eyes. It's the energy of the probe. Okay? So the analogy, you know, you can have in mind is that essentially, you know, space-time is like a quantum crystal. It has some structure. It has some delocalization feature at short scale. And the electrons are the probe. And of course, what you see, what you call space-time is what the electron sees. And what you see depends really on the energy of the electrons. So now, you know, this was just an illustration. And this analogy suggests that the proper geometrical setting, if you want to discuss the geometry of the quantum, is not classical space-time. You cannot think that your object is living in classical space-time. And this is the mistake, or the hypothesis, the mistake we're making when we think about physics in terms of space-time. What we have to do in this, you know, general context of relative locality is that the geometrical framework in which physics takes place is phase-space. Now, yes. Yeah, we're going to see that. Yeah. We're going to hopefully see that. I mean, there's a fundamental. We're going to go there. There's a fundamental length scale and a fundamental energy scale. So now, okay. So this is I say that localization property, you know, you cannot talk about localization property in quantum mechanical setting without giving information about the energy. It's just somehow meaningless. But now what does this point of view has? What does relative locality has to do with quantum gravity, the point of view of quantum gravity, or asymptotic safety, or string theory? And to some extent, it's decoupled. But it's related, of course, to this approach in the sense that in quantum gravity, you conclude that you have discreteness of space-time, and that always naturally leads to some kind of non-trivial geometry in momentum space. This was exemplified in 3D absolutely clearly, and there are kind of generalized argument in 4D. Now, in asymptotic safety, you assume that you postulate that there is a non-trivial fixed point, which is there, but this non-trivial fixed point is fundamentally a geometrical fixed point, which is highly non-local. And you have to, if you really want to understand the nature of these geometrical fixed points, you have to say, well, is there some kind of quasi-geometrical description of the physics around that? If you don't have that, it's kind of almost useless to know that there's such a fixed point there. So let's say relative locality aims at somehow trying to describe what kind of geometry really is at play when you go at this Planck scale. Now, string theory, as was mentioned, is fundamentally a non-local theory. The popular understanding today is that it's essentially just a fix for effective field theory. And this is fundamentally wrong. String theory is fundamentally a non-local theory. And in fact, we're going to see in the next talk that string theory incorporate the principle of relative locality at its onset. So it's a good test ground for these sets of ID. And essentially, relative locality is essentially related to understanding the symmetry of string theory, which is called T-duality. We're going to see it's the same thing. Okay, so as I say, we want to somehow think about phase space as some kind of geometrical setting. So let me try to walk you through what could be the geometry of momentum space, and then why is that reasonable? So of phase space, sorry. So I want to put together space-time and momentum space into phase space. And when I say phase space, I'm going to say all the time phase space. I'm really thinking about a relativistic phase space before I impose a constraint, so it includes time and energy. And I'm also not thinking, for gravitational people, sometimes it's confusing because they talk about the phase space of gravitational field, which is the space of metrics and momenta. That's not what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about the phase space associated with one probe, like the particle probe or the one particle object, if you want. The one probe object, that is the object that fields live on. Okay, this is what I'm thinking about. The geometry of space-time, we know, is encoded into a Lorentzian metric and satisfies Einstein equation. So what is the geometry of momentum space? Now, this is what we're going to discuss. To unify space-time with energy and momenta, it's absolutely obvious that in order to do that, we need first a fundamental energy scale and a fundamental length scale. In fact, if you think about it, it's not exactly true. What we really need is a conversion scale that converts energy into length. So we need a fundamental tension. If you have a fundamental tension in the game, which is a ratio of energy over length, then you can put together space and momentum. Okay, so in a theory of quantum gravity, you do have a fundamental length scale, the Planck length, and you do have a fundamental energy scale, and you can create this dimensionless formulation. In fact, what you have in gravity, and that's going to be important, is that you do have a fundamental tension, which is the inverse of the Newton constant. Okay, so in this dimensionless unit, this is the commutation relation you have. So, and of course, any theory of quantum gravity or any theory that delocalizes in the way I'm going to do, by essence, has a fundamental length scale and a fundamental energy scale. Now, phase space. What I want to show you is that phase space naturally possesses three natural geometrical structures. Two of them are kind of well known to specialists. The third one has been completely obliterated. There's three natural structures. There's a symplectic structure. Of course, it's a phase space, so it's an antisymmetric two-form that defines dp dq, which with inverse is the Poisson bracket. So that's why we call it phase space. This is a classical structure. Okay, but it also possesses naturally two metrics, and these two metrics we're going to see they appear naturally in the geometry of quantum mechanics. As soon as you say quantum mechanics, you have an extra two metrics on phase space. This is what quantum mechanics is about, as viewed from a classical geometric view standpoint. Okay, there's one metric which I call the quantum metric, that people know well. Sometimes in the literature it's called generalized metric. And there's a new one that I call the locality metric. So what are these? Let me think that I'm working in Darboux coordinates. So locally, I can always do that. So what is the kind of form of these metrics in these Darboux coordinates? The quantum metric H needs a conversion factor, something that converts P into Q. And here, I'm going to, one of the hypotheses of this whole setting is that we understood I want to have a new take on the equivalence principle. In some sense, it's saying, well, we didn't understand the equivalence principle properly. For me, the universality of free fall, I want to interpret it as the fact that G Newton, so inverse of G Newton, you look at the dimension, it's a constant at the dimension over mass over distance. And the equivalence principle says that this conversion scale factor is the same for any form of matter. So now I want to take the standpoint that this equivalence principle tells me that I should treat 1 over G Newton, this tension, as I treat C square. And a conversion factor between energy and momenta, a fundamental conversion factor between energy and momenta that allow them to put together. This is the real reason, the real meaning behind the equivalence principle. That's the point of view which is made here. And which means that once you have such a conversion factor, such a universal tension, then, in Darboux coordinate, there's a natural metric which is essentially dq squared plus dp squared. Right? So the ratio of dq squared over dp squared is always divided by this gravitational tension. Now, you would say, well, I don't see this metric when I do space-time interpretation. I see only dq squared. And I would answer, well, that's of course absolutely obvious. For all practical purpose, you don't really care about the thickness of events in momentum space because the gravitational tension is huge. The gravitational tension is 10 to the 17 kilogram per angstrom. So if you really want to see, so I'm saying the thickness in momentum space is there, but for all practical purpose, we ignore it, in the experiment. Any experiment that doesn't really, that allow you to neglect that. Compared to that, will make you look as if you were living in a usual space-time metric. So in relative locality, we see that the space-time metric is essentially the projection or the leftover of this quantum metric. Okay. I guess that's clear. Now, there's another metric that we need to do because in physics, we are not really confused about what is x and what is xp. In our realm, I'm not localizing myself in momentum space when I'm moving from x1 to x2, even at constant momenta. So there's clearly a sense that in order to do physics, you need to have some field that tells you what is x and what is p. And this is what this locality metric is. In Darboux coordinate, this locality metric looks like dp dq. The contraction of P with Q, and of course Q is a vector and P is a one form, so there's a natural contraction metric there. This metric has signature DD. It looks like the Darboux form, but it's really a symmetric object. And now, once you have such a metric, you can easily say what is space-time. You can say that space-time is like a null cone, is the space of null directions for this metric. And momentum space is the space of the transverse null directions here. And what such a metric determines, it determines a B-Lagrangian structure. Okay, it determines that at every point in phase space, you know exactly what you call x and what you call p, and that's not a surprise to you because you intuitively assume that you know what you call x and you know what you call p. You don't get confused about it when you do physics. So because you don't get confused about it, what you're really doing mathematically is you're assuming a preferred B-Lagrangian structure on phase space. That's what you're doing. This is the hidden assumption. And this is exemplified here in relative locality. Space-time is not an absolute notion. You view it as a slice of phase space and essentially as a Lagrangian submanifold. That is a submanifold whose restriction of the symplectic structure vanish. But the question is which one? I mean, for all practical purpose, you could do physics on this slice, so you could do physics on this slice, and if you stay on this slice, nothing will be different at any moment. But you also need to know what is your notion of momentum space. So you really need to know this B Lagrangian structure. And the mathematical theorem is that such a choice is equivalent to a choice of metric, this locality metric. And space-time and momentum space are by definition null with respect to this metric. So when you say that you know what space-time is, you're assuming that you have a preferred background metric in phase space. That's what I already say. Space-time is not subspace for eta. Now I can formulate mathematically absolute locality. Absolute locality is actually the statement that somehow this notion of space-time is an absolute notion. It's non-dynamical, it's God-given, it's eternal. And this translates into the fact that you're assuming that this metric is flat. If this metric is flat, you have a notion of absolute locality. And you're assuming that the splitting between space and momentum space is non-dynamical. So this is the hypothesis I'm going to relax, which means that now I'm going to allow this metric to be curved. And I'm also going to allow, when I think about space-time, allow a notion of symmetry to be generalized, because now I'm allowing symmetries to mix between P and Qs. And the space-time metric, the usual notion, is essentially the pullback of the quantum metric on the Lagrangian. So generically, this pullback metric, this space-time metric, is some kind of rainbow metric. It depends where you are in momentum space, as it is for the electron. But it really descends from this more natural and general structure. So let me, emphasize that the geometry of phase space possesses two metrics: the quantum metric and the locality metric. One defines the splitting space momentum, the other one defines the space-time metric. And in fact, in the two theory we know in quantum mechanics, H, where we're going to see H is essentially the information metric or the probability metric. So H is flat in quantum mechanics by definition. It's the Born rule. Okay? But eta is arbitrary. I can rotate polarization arbitrarily. So this is Born duality. Now, in relativity, this is exactly the reverse that we say. In relativity, eta is fixed. Space-time is a preferred polarization. But H, at least the one projected on L can be curved. So we see that clearly the incompatibility between these two theories are that they are making absolutely opposite assumptions about what is the geometry of phase space. Okay? And it's clear that if you want to unify them, you have to somehow allow both to be on the same ground. Yeah, if you have, it's a metric that determines the what is x and yeah. If it's flat, then it's yeah. When you assume a space-time, you're assuming the flatness of that metric. Okay, and then of course it leads to two strategies. Either you start from GR and you try to quantize it, or you start from quantum mechanics and you try to gravitize it, which is that you try to curve the other metric, which is not flat. Okay, so now maybe let me go faster. What's remarkable is that if you look at the geometry of quantum mechanics, you see exactly this structure appearing. And this is what mathematicians have done. So I'm looking at quantum mechanics as mathematicians do, and they say, well, quantum mechanics, you need a phase space, you have a symplectic structure that's classical, then, you need to understand, you need to construct a Hilbert space, and it's well known in geometrical quantization that to construct a Hilbert space, what you need to do is to give a complex structure on your phase space. If you give me a complex structure on your phase space, geometrical quantization provide a natural Hilbert space as the space of holomorphic sections. Okay, so essentially the choice of complex structure, and the choice of complex structure is the same thing as the choice of a quantum metric H. So a choice of quantum metric is the same thing as a choice of Hilbert space. Okay, but if you want to do quantum mechanics, not only you need to know your Hilbert space, but you need to know how to multiply things. So you also need to define what is the star product. And in fact, it's a beautiful result proved by Fedosov that a choice of star product is uniquely determined on a symplectic manifold by a choice of a symplectic connection, which is now called a Fedosov connection compatible with the symplectic structure. And it's a well-known theorem that such symplectic connections are in one-to-one correspondence with B Lagrangians, therefore with the locality metric. So if you give me a locality metric, you're fixing the operator of product ambiguity. So to define quantum mechanics, you need both these structures. They appear absolutely mechanically, if you want. So these metrics are the natural structure of quantum mechanics. Well, I mean, gravitize, it's, at this stage, is still a word. What I mean is that I have to think about the Born rule, which is a linear rule, being curved in some sense. I'm not claiming that I know the answer to that, but I'm thinking it's a new way to think about. But the Born rule will always, be linear in some sense. So you want, it's a new way to think. I don't want to talk about gravitizing the quantum. I'm just putting the word out there. It's a talk on its own, which you start purely from quantum mechanics and then you try to think about the geometry of quantum mechanics. So I'm just saying it gives you a completely new way to, depending on your background, to think about the problem of quantum gravity. You don't have to be stuck to quantizing GR. There's another way which could be purely, if your obsession is quantum mechanics, there's a way to think about quantum gravity purely from a foundational quantum mechanics point of view, which is very, and of course they all should lead to the same point. That's the beauty about it. Now, okay, let me skip that. This is what I was saying. Essentially, this is what I say. H is the Born rule. It's the informational metric. So if you have a complex structure, you have this naturally flat metric. And eta is the choice of operator ordering. Okay, and this is a beautiful result that I would love to explain. I could take 10 slides to explain why a geometrical structure is equivalent to operator ordering. Now, this is going to be the purpose of George's talk, but one of the examples, of course, string theory provides a natural example of relativistic quantum and non-local probe. So, if I'm right, that relative locality is the principle, it better be in string, and that was the initial. When I started to talk to my, stringy friend, I was asking them whether, they see relative locality. And of course, in the beginning, string as it's presented today doesn't include that principle. And we're going to see with George how it's possible to include it, how it's possible to understand that string doesn't live in space-time, but string lives in phase space. Now, the way to think about it is that if you look at the space of CFT, so essentially string theory is defined as the space of consistent CFT. If you look at the space of consistent CFT around flat background, the usual string literature focus on what I call the Polyakov string, the one which have a space-time interpretation. And this one corresponds to a small subset of possible conformal deformation. So it means that the usual string, the space-time string, the Polyakov string, doesn't explore the sets of all possible conformal deformation. So if you're consistent with the philosophy of string, you should explore all possible conformal deformation. And if you do that, you find that the natural way to include all possible conformal deformation is to give, to define string in terms of this phase space geometry that we initially called the Born geometry in some sense. Okay, so the target space of string, as you're going to see, is really the same thing as the geometry of relative locality. Now, the main result that we have today is that so classical string propagate in phase space, but you can ask, what about quantum string? And what happens is that quantum string propagates in quantum phase space, which is a non-commutative space. Okay, and then you can ask, what is the effective field description of string theory? And the field of the string don't live in space-time as a consequence. The fields of strings lives in what I call the modular space-time. So let me try to explain you what is modular space-time. So naively, I would say, even if I forget about the string, I would say, well, you're telling me that the geometrical realm is phase space, so therefore my fields need to live on phase space. Okay? But this is not good. First, because we know that there's a limit where it depends only on Q and not P. So how do I get rid of this extra P dependence? It looks like too much. And the second thing is that P and Q at the quantum level is a non-commutative space, and therefore, if my field starts to commute or non-commute, I'm somehow violating the principle of microcausality. So the principle that observables things that I observe have to, commute with each other. So there should be a sense in which my fundamental description should be commuting with itself. And in fact, this is exactly how you find modular spacetime. You can say, what is the notion of a field on modular spacetime? So classically, a field is a function of Q and P that depends only on Q. So it's a function of Q and P that Poisson commute with itself, if you want. Okay? So you could say, well, okay, let's do that at the quantum level. Define the space of field from a non-commutative perspective as the subalgebra, a commutative subalgebra, have the space as the algebra of function on phase space. The algebra of function on phase space, non-commutative algebra. You can look at the subalgebra of it. And naively you would say, okay, no big deal, I'm going to find exactly what I found classically, that something which is commuting quantum mechanically is essentially something living on a Lagrangian space-time. That's wrong. The beauty about quantum mechanics, and this is, you know, the first one that really understood that is Aharonov, is that quite bizarrely, there are more things commuting at the quantum level than they are at the classical level. And this is why we have the phenomenon of interferences. The phenomenon of interferences is tied up to the fact that there are things that at the quantum level commutes that would never, ever, ever commute at the classical level. At the classical level, if I take the Poisson bracket of a function of p with a function of q, I cannot find 0. But at the quantum level, it's possible. And let me give you an example. These examples are these modular observables. So essentially define the notion of p to be p modulo h bar over r. And clearly you see that this variable, when I send h bar to 0, doesn't exist, so it has no classical analog. And q to be q modulo r, where r is, let's say, your Planck scale, or, yeah, or any other scale you like to put. Then you can prove that these two observables, this one depends on your p, this one depends on your q, they commute at the quantum level, but they don't commute classically. Okay, so this is the miracle of modular observable, which means that you have a notion of modular space-time, which essentially is the space described by p and q, this modular variable. So at the quantum level, you have a new notion of space-time, which is a geometry in the sense that you know, every point on it commutes with itself, so it's a manifold, but which is by essence quantum, in the sense that the only way you can define space-time is because you have quantum mechanics. There would be no way to define what space-time is if you didn't have this notion of non-commutativity in the first place. So this is in that sense that this notion is an interesting one. It's not like you're resolving the tension between space-time and quantum mechanics by trying to put one on top of the other. Is that by definition one, you know, is defined in the other. And the way a modular space-time looks is like it looks more like, you know, instead of looking like a long slice of phase space, it looks more like a cell in phase space of area 2h bar. And of course, the space-time we're used to are the space-time where somehow the thickness, this is this hugeness of the gravitational tension, the thickness in p space is very small compared to the thickness in x space. So we see an extended space, but we see a very tiny portion of you know, momentum space relative to the energy we're probing it. Okay, so in the limit, you know, of course I can squash my cell and recover the usual notion of space-time, but I'm forgetting the fact that it has a little thickness in p space. And modular space-time is quantum in essence. So to conclude, let me tell you a little bit what are the features of this modular space-time. Is that the effective field of string, or you know, you can think about the notion of field theory on modular space-time. That is, these are fields which, you know, are going to satisfy now not one but two equations, because I have these two metrics. You know, the box with respect to h and the box with respect to eta. For massless field, it would be 0. And then the interactions are going to be local in phase space in this modular space. But locality in phase space is much more than it's much more complicated than locality in space-time. Of course, if you know, this equation box theta equal phi is essentially dp dq. So one way to satisfy this equation is just to demand that dp doesn't depend, that phi doesn't depend on the momentum direction, and then you recover usual field theory. But if you study this theory at the quantum level, you find that the fundamental excitation of these theories are not point-like particles, they are dionic objects. That is, they are objects which have the property that their extension is proportional to their momenta. Okay? So this is this fundamental relation that the more energy you put in, at some level, you start to explore bigger region than, you know, rather than smaller region. And another feature of the theory is that the notion of Lorentz symmetry is extended. Of course, there's the usual Lorentz symmetry in phase space that you know, boost Q and you inverse boost P. But there's a new type of symmetry, which is essentially that you are allowed now, which is responsible, for instance, it's manifest in Born-Infeld formulation, but it's a symmetry that allow you to rotate P and Q. And this one is absolutely bizarre and fascinating, and this is something we are really investigating, because this one violates any concept of locality you might have. Sorry? It's not exactly the canonical, because this is the one that preserves eta, not omega. But it's like a Bogoliubov-like transformation, which mix space and momentum space. And such transformations are totally forbidden, right? In field theory, you can't get confused about, because a small momentum space is a large X, okay? So when you do gravity of field theory, this is absolutely out of the question to assume such kind of transformation. You cannot even formulate or think about it. But you can think of it as a canonical transformation if you want, that respects the type of dynamics of the theory. So, as I say, the fundamental equations are dyons. There's an extended Lorentz symmetry. So, what is the main prediction, on a broad scale of such approach? The main prediction is that we see that in both examples. If you have something that increases size when you increase the momenta, as let's say a black hole would do, but you extend that kind of symmetry property to fundamental objects, then clearly what you're doing is violating the separation of scale. You're violating one of the fundamental principles of physics, locality. Okay, and essentially the main prediction of such an approach is that we expect a fundamental infrared UV mixing in fundamental physics. And in our view, this is how we are going to see quantum gravity effects, in the fact that subtle correlations between UV observable and infrared observable. And in my view, there's no other way to really witness anything quantum gravitational. And of course, the conclusion is that effective field theory doesn't survive this unification. So any reasoning that attempt to approach quantum gravity from the quantum effective field theory is just doomed from the onset. Anyway, but a new notion of locality appears, which is modular locality. And let me conclude. Relaxation of locality needs certain principle, relative locality, bound reciprocity. There is a geometrical description in phase space. It's realized in some example, like in string theory. And a new concept of space-time that was not unraveled before. You have to think of this modular space-time as the first example. It's flat. It's like the Minkowski of relative locality. Okay, so we're just on the beginning of understanding, let's say, Minkowski space, like pre-gravitation. We're thinking about curving this structure itself. But field theory, as we know, it doesn't survive the unification. For me, that's a clear cut. Okay, and I think we satisfied the principle of Bohr for, a good proposal.
Yeah, so we have time for -1 question. Quick. Go. No?
Yeah, go.
Okay.
Go.
Okay,
go
ahead, but quick.
Yeah, so first it's not entirely kinematical. That is, it's a geometry. So then I can understand what is the dynamical feature of that geometry as probed by fields. Now, what you're asking is, this what I call this extensification process, which is, space-time appears to us to be large. And the process by which it appears to be large is the same way that we know the world is quantum mechanical, but you don't live in a quantum mechanical world. You live in a classical world. And the reason for that, of course, is that fundamentally we don't really know. But what we expect is that it's due to coarse graining, right? You have many degrees of freedom. And here, coarse graining will appear as a concatenation of cells. But what I'm saying here is that in some sense, your question is tied up with the measurement problem question. In some sense, explaining why space-time is large is the same thing as explaining why the world looks classical. Okay? So it's as easy or as hard. And I don't have the full answer to that, but the short answer is that, yeah, it's a coarse-graining process. So it's because if you probe the universe with very coarse-grained observable, it looks classical. But there are other observables. That's the claim we're making. which, you know, don't see space-time like that. Of course, you know, like in, you know, there are quantum mechanical observables that don't see physics as classical, but you have to first know the quantum theory to engineer such observation, and that's really the goal here, is that such observations of this cell structure is possible, but you first have to understand your theory of how you're going to be able to probe that thing. And if you think in terms of effectivity theory, by definition, you will never even be able to conceive an experiment.
Great. So I suggest to postpone further question to the next talk, because it's on a similar related topic. And we thank Laurent again.